Welcome to 21st Century Radio. I'm Dr. Zohara Hieronymus. Laura Kortner is our executive producer and Anita Brockington, our engineer. For the past 35 years, I've interviewed physicists, spiritual teachers, healing practitioners, and numerous esotericists who all point the same direction for human development and evolution, to understanding that we are spiritual beings having a material experience, and that while we are incarnate, we can experience the supersensible capacities written about in all sacred traditions throughout the world, whether through plants, meditative practices, or other rigorous forms of self-discipline. They do show us that human beings are multidimensional, and that our ability to be engaged with the subtle fields of reality, such as our etheric or energetic body, our astral or emotional bodies, our causal and mental bodies, our Buddhic and even greater atmic bodies, are our inheritance. Joining us this hour is Dr. Shelli Joye to discuss a most elegant book she has authored, Developing Supersensible Perception, Knowledge of the Higher Worlds Through Entheogens, Prayer, and Nondual Awareness, an Inner Tradition 2019 release. Dr. Joye has done truly an amazing job of showing just how the Western mystery esotericists and founder of anthroposophy Rudolf Steiner and the ancient Vedic texts of Patanjali are talking about the same realities, each in their own language. She shows us that we are so very near to understanding how to make use of our total consciousness instead of our simple three-dimensional view of the world and ourselves, explaining how when we break it all down with everything we know, there is a space-time domain and a frequency domain, and they interact all of the time just as our nerves and our blood plasma does. Joining us for what I know will be an amazing hour that puts a masterful puzzle from centuries ago to modern physics and its mathematics and our quest for understanding consciousness into a comprehensive overview is our guest, Dr. Shelli Joye. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Joye.
Well, I'm really happy to be here and be able to talk with you, Dr. Zohara.
Well, your book is simply amazing, truthfully. So let's start where you do. As a child in the New York library stacks, already on search for truth.
Well, I wasn't really a child. I went to New York when I just graduated from college, and I was searching for information on esoteric. I studied engineering in college, but an experience of LSD in California in my senior year made me really focus on consciousness, and I wanted to explore consciousness and try to understand the physics of it and the sort of engineering applications, how you could actually find the most practical way of expanding consciousness without drugs. So I was in the public library, and I had discovered that there was a whole wealth of information, of data, that science was totally dismissing. And it's found in the writings of mystics and saints and a few scientists who've been categorized as black sheep by the halls of science. But the sad thing is most of material science has gone in the direction of measuring things in space and time. And anything that they can't measure in space and time is kind of ignored. They do accept psychology because psychologists can do statistical studies, but very little has been done in trying to, most scientists are very smart, and they're not using their brilliance to investigate generations of information that mystics have left us. So I was looking for information, trying to connect the dots between physics and my own experiences of LSD and a few other entheogens. And I discovered the best way was looking through books in the library. So I was in the public library in New York, and there was a book open on the table. And it's so funny because I'd been reading a lot about Carl Jung, reading actually some of his essays and his collected works, which I had managed to acquire. He was the closest thing for a while that I found between science and mysticism, Carl Jung's work. So I had really been studying the ideas of synchronicity, that things, if you sort of relax and let things go, synchronicity, the universe will sort of speak to you. Things will happen and fall into place that are can't be coincidental. There's some kind of a pattern going on. Anyway, I experienced a synchronistic episode there in the library because I sat down at a table and put my other books down, and I saw a book that was open. And I looked at the book, and it was called In Search of the Miraculous. And I said, that's kind of what I'm doing. So what is this book about? So I looked inside, and I was even further impressed because it was written by somebody with a PhD in mathematics, a Russian mathematician named Uspensky. So luckily the book was there, so I checked it out. And when I got home, I started reading it seriously. I think I stayed up till dawn reading that book. I was so amazed. And it describes his experience, direct experience, and his theories, and the theories of his teacher, who was George Ivanovich Gurdjieff. He had been an Armenian Greek mystic back in the early part of last century. So that was my experience in the library. And I must say my experience in New York during my mid-20s was really rich. I had studied electrical engineering, and I was actually working in the World Trade Center during the day, but I spent my nights and weekends doing two things. I was trying to research consciousness through reading books on mysticism from various cultures, and I was also trying to paint because painting is art is a way of developing certain parts of your awareness that are not necessarily associated with the thinking brain. So I spent many weekends at Samuel Weisner's bookstore.
The best.
In New York.
That used to, oh my God, that was the best bookstore when I lived in there. I lived up in New York myself. I think anybody who had the opportunity to go to Weiser's at its heyday, it was like, oh my God, what a joy.
Yeah, and you know, my current publisher is Inner Traditions, and I discovered after they accepted my book that the founder of Inner Traditions had been a clerk at Samuel Weiser's bookstore.
Yeah, Ehud
in the
Sperling.
early 70s, about the same time that I actually lived about 2 blocks from there. I lived on East 6th Street and Avenue A. It was really a bad neighborhood. For me, it was good because I was on a 5th floor walk-up, so I got some good exercise going up and down, carrying groceries and things. But it was also very quiet on the 5th floor in the inner room, so I had a good place where I could meditate and practice yoga and contemplation.
So
but yeah, Samuel Weiser's bookstore was amazing. And,
right, and then for a while in D.C. we had the Yes bookstore. I mean, there haven't been many, and other than Inner Traditions, also our publisher. They are definitely the finest publisher of this kind of wisdom tradition today. So let's look at some of the big pieces that you put together, because it's so interesting to me that you talked about Rudolf Steiner's work and as well as Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. And I liked that you mentioned, Steiner's whole history of having been in his 20s a student of theosophy, and that he had a different perspective, and then he started and founded his own organization of anthroposophy. But Steiner, as you point out, shared that we have supersensible organs, and we have different types of thinking that are associated with the human experience. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that, the imaginative thinking and active thinking and the other kinds of thinking that go on, intuitive thinking, which Einstein actually even said was the greatest gift we have.
Yeah, sure. And actually, Einstein, I thought, I believe he was somewhat intuitive and somewhat, he did all 3 modes of thinking, I'm sure. He played the violin also, which some people don't know. And it's important. I'll explain why I gravitated towards Steiner when I first found some of his books was, I'm having a degree in engineering. I was kind of impressed by the fact that Steiner studied engineering at the Vienna Institute of Technology, and so I kind of give credibility to mystics who have engineering degrees or math degrees or physics degrees. I guess it's a prejudice. We all have some prejudice.
No, but I think it's representative whole brain thinking because they're highly intuitive, but then also highly rational. I have found that kind of combination. You see it in Goethe too. I see it in many of the writers I've been most interested in over my life. So
Steiner, like Gurdjieff, was interested, or he saw that there were 3 modes of thinking. In fact, actually, Steiner, in the early part of his career, he went and studied Johann Wolfgang Goethe's voluminous works. And Goethe was he said thinking is an organ of perception.
Mm-hmm.
And Steiner also thought it was. Gurdjieff actually wrote a 1,200-page book, Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson, which deals with the three brain beings. He says humans are three brain beings, but that most of us are very unbalanced. We only have one or at the most two of those ways of thinking active or developed. And Steiner said it's really important, and so did Gurdjieff, to develop all three modes of thinking. So what are these modes of thinking? Well, Steiner called one of them the imaginative or emotional thinking. And this is what children think with. It's a way of imitating, of absorbing information through your physical senses and retaining information on what's seen and experienced. And it's also sort of an awareness of the world that is sort of a wide spectrum view of the world, whereas what children are eventually taught to do, and what most of us in our culture do, is mostly work with active thinking. The brain is very much electrically wired for active thinking, and in some ways it acts like a laptop. You might think of it as like a laptop computer because it deals with memories and logic and sequential thinking. So it's also pretty masculine. There's been a lot of studies showing that they tend to think that the left hemisphere of the brain is more masculine, and the right hemisphere of the brain is more feminine, more dealing with what Steiner called the imaginative or emotional thinking. But in our culture, we've totally stressed active thinking. In fact, the active thinking has made us almost like dinosaurs, sort of out of balance, because our whole culture is full of words. You look at billboards, you look at your computer, you look at even your watch now, and your iWatch has all kinds of words and symbols in a sequential way. So I think that's partly, or maybe primarily, why our culture is seeing a lot of violence and confusion and lack of harmony. What Steiner said was we need to develop the active thinking, which is like the laptop brain, the imaginative emotional thinking, which is the more feminine right hemisphere, but also what he calls intuitive thinking. And intuitive thinking is like going within you to be taught, in intuition, to be taught by looking within. And that's what mystics and saints and psychonauts do. People who even take entheogens sometimes find themselves almost lost within the intuitive thinking universe because they don't have a lot of experience there. So what Steiner did was actually he developed a system of teaching called the Waldorf schools, and probably many of your listeners have heard of Waldorf schools. There's right now still about 800 of them in Europe and 200 in the U.S.
Yeah, we have one here in
Baltimore. What they do is they try to develop a child's fuller self, not just focus on logic and math and words and history, reading, writing, and arithmetic are all active thinking, but they also insist that the child has art, studies art and music and movement. Like Steiner called it eurythmy. It's almost like a Tai Chi movement, moving very slow and being very aware and being very quiet internally. And this theme of being quiet is also really important for Steiner, that it's in the silence that you start to develop intuitive thinking. And what does he mean by silence? Well, both silence auditorially, you could be in a very quiet room or in the forest where it's quiet. It's a good place to meditate. But also just to quiet down the laptop mind, all the electrical impulses in your cerebral cortex, flashing back and forth. It's almost like we have an inbox with about 20 thoughts waiting to pop up, and there's one on top of the other, and there's, last in, first out kind of. If you try to stop thinking about one thing, there's something else waiting to raise its hand and jump into the driver's seat. So the idea is to learn how to, through practice, even practicing 5 minutes a day. I practice 30 minutes a day, which I think is fine. Now and then I do it twice a day, but usually it's 30 minutes a day. You practice turning off your laptop mind, making it very quiet. And what does that do? Well, for one thing, there's a very interesting couple of studies recently that show that they were trying to look at the brains through scans, seeing what parts of the brain became very active and lit up when people were taking psilocybin, which is sort of an ayahuasca component. And so they know that when people take ayahuasca, they have all kinds of activity of visions and visit strange entities and things. They're not thinking very logically or in words, but they're seeing all these things happen. So what part of the brain lit up? They found that none of them lit up. All of the cerebral cortex gets very quiet and dark when people are experiencing these wild ayahuasca visions.
So, and I thought it was interesting. We do have to take a break. That you quoted Steiner saying that intuitive thinking is itself, quote, the highest form of cognition possible for man on earth. And in the same way, the sutras, as you point out, of Patanjali, put it this way: that, quote, yoga is the silencing of the activity of the brain mind. We'll be right back. If you're just joining us, Dr. Shelli Joye is with us. His extraordinary book, Developing Supersensible Perception. I can see we would have needed 2 hours to do this in any remote justice, but we're going to do our best. Knowledge of the higher worlds through Entheogens, prayer, and Nondual awareness, an Inner Traditions 2019 release. And you can visit his website at Shelli, Shelli, Joye, Joye.net. That's ShelliJoye.net.
Hi, my name is Dawson Church. I'm the author of the new book, Mind to Matter, The Astonishing Science of How Your Brain Creates Material Reality. In the book, you'll find how your brain creates molecules literally inside your body and outside of yourself as well. So please get a copy at mindtomatter.com. And thank you so much for listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Zoe Hieronymus.
Welcome back to 21st Century Radio. If you're just joining us, Dr. Shelli Joye is with us. She has written a most remarkable book, and I kept thinking to myself, wow, somebody who has really put together the esoterics, the science, the latest in understanding light and what happens to consciousness and nerves and plasma, and there's just so much here. We won't get to it all, so I want you all to read her book, Developing Supersensible Perception, Knowledge of the Higher Worlds Through Entheogens, Prayer, and Nondual Awareness, an Inner Traditions 2019 release, and her website, Shelli Joye, Shelli Joye, Joye.net. So, Shelli, because there's so much more to cover, can I breeze ahead to your work with Steiner and others about the nervous system and the etheric body and the astral within the blood? I thought that your contributions were so stunning, and I want to get to some of the big chunks of it.
Oh, sure.
So maybe you could bring us up to speed about, these different bodies that we are, and, that the etheric body is a vehicle for prana and a bridge between the physical and the astral. But tell it in your own words.
Okay, well, actually, Steiner started out working with Madame Blavatsky. She was somewhat older than him, but he got very interested in theosophy, and he even became the head of all the theosophists in Germany for a while. But he felt that she was going too far toward Asian philosophies and Asian cultures, and some things he didn't agree with. He was an engineer first. He was trained as an engineer, but also a Christian. He was brought up in Vienna as a Catholic. So he wanted to bring more Christianity into it, and he broke with her in 1912 and started his anthroposophy organization, which grew really large in the 20s and 30s. So I'd like to talk about then what the theosophists started talking about. They called it that our body has a physical, an astral, an etheric, and a causal dimension. And what does that mean? Well, physical dimension, of course, is all of our molecules and our systems. We're basically built out of energy that's vibrating at high frequencies in set patterns of molecules and material flesh and things. The astral body he associates with the blood, and I'll explain that in a minute. And the etheric, you can think of E for electricity. The etheric body is what we think with, what we use logic and words and our brain, basically. The astral, Steiner said, it helps us communicate with the stars. And what does he mean by that? When a baby is just the very first cell of the baby, it divides and it leaves a neural tube, a little tiny neural tube. There's no neurons or brain material, obviously, in the little tiny zygote that's growing, but there is like a rudimentary cardiovascular system. It's pumping, it's like pulsating, and it has liquid in it. Well, this becomes the cardiovascular system of capillaries, arteries, and veins. And people would be surprised to know that in one adult, all of these stretch end to end. If you stretch them end to end, they'd stretch about 60,000 miles. The capillaries alone, which are the smallest of the blood vessels, would make up about 48,000 miles in a single human. And you can think of these as waveguides. In electrical engineering, we actually distribute the internet through what are called waveguides using optical fiber cables. And they act very similar as the capillaries. The capillaries carry infrared radiation, which can relate to the astral. If you think of the heart, our image of the heart is, well, aside from Valentine's Day, and you have a hard heart or a soft heart, or you should open your heart, the emotions, the part of thinking that Steiner calls imaginative or emotional, the more female of the three systems, is in the blood system and in the heart. And Steiner and other religions have also taught that by focusing on your heart, you can slowly develop a way of thinking and perceiving with the heart that is different than the thinking and perceiving of the brain and the neurons and the cerebral hemisphere. So we actually have three different systems of consciousness within our single body. And they're developed to different degrees. And as I was saying earlier, in our current culture, the active thinking, the brain, is so highly developed at the expense of the other two that people are really no longer in balance. You can go crazy by just thinking too much. I mean, everyone probably has that feeling if their mind is spinning round and round, and how do you stop it? Well, Steiner would say you stop it by practicing silence of the brain and starting to feel and cultivate what Patanjali and different yoga teachings have said are your chakras. So what are the chakras? The chakras are areas within the body that are full of nerve plexes and capillaries and endocrine glands, and they're almost like separate brains, like distributed brains within the human. It's almost like cloud computing. And in fact, our cosmos is fundamentally a distributed network of consciousness. Of course, that's panpsychism, which, it's a philosophy where people believe that everything is really alive, that there's really nothing that's dead because it's all within sort of the living territory that we call God or the divine, or one reality. So how do you develop your chakras? By being quiet, by quieting the active thinking mind, the mind in your head mostly, and focusing your awareness for sustained moments. It could even be just a few seconds, but focusing on, say, your heart. Or there's a chakra in your throat, there's one just below your lungs, there's one in your abdomen, and there's one down in your perineum, and there's one at the very top of your head. And there's one in the center of your head also. So the supersensible perception starts to occur at a certain point of development of your intuitive thinking. And to do that just takes practice and persistence. And this is probably the most important thing that people could learn in our culture to develop health and sanity is to develop this intuitive capacity to listen to your inner guides. And what that means is, some people have probably heard or read about Seth. Seth speaks. Somebody channeled this entity named Seth. He talked about having two egos, an inner ego and an outer ego. Well, our outer ego is basically running with our laptop mind, our sense of identity, our physical identity. But the inner ego that you can contact through intuitive thinking is our real self. It's actually a sort of a doppelganger that exists in the other dimensions beyond space and time. Space and time are four dimensions, if you count them up. Space has three dimensions, X, Y, Z, 90 degrees to each other that can be measured. And time, of course, is linear. So you have four dimensions. But modern quantum mechanics points towards string theory, and M theory says there are 7 or 8 additional dimensions. And these dimensions do not have any space or time in them. And they're located at very small dimensions at the center everywhere within our bodies and actually within the whole material realm. In fact, it's like God looking out from the center everywhere from these tiny, tiny dimensions. And imagine part of us actually lives in these other dimensions. So the trick is to be very quiet and start to sense these inner dimensions. And Steiner, he wrote, I think, published 200 books, and there's like 700 papers that he's written and published. Many of them were just transcripts of his lectures, which were voluminous lectures over 20 years. He gives many, many tips on how to practice and what to notice and why we should even try this. Well, why we try this, it reminds me of Gauguin's famous painting he did in Tahiti he named it, Where Do We Come From? What Are We? And Where Are We Going? And it's only by meditating, learning to be quiet, and coming in touch with our inner, deeper self that we start to really find out where we come from, what we are, and where we're going. It's one thing I added to my book, and it's in the title, that some people might be interested in, is I talk about knowledge of the higher worlds through entheogens, prayer, and non-dual awareness. I've discovered that entheogens really do help people in the beginning to get in touch with higher worlds, higher dimensions, these inner dimensions. They're doppelganger that's normally concealed by the overactive, hyperactive thinking mind. We're always thinking in words and thinking about, what are we having for dinner, or what did I say wrong to my friend, or did I do my taxes, and we just, that part of the mind doesn't shut up and allow us to get in touch with our deeper self. And this impinges on health, because if you're able to contact your inner healer, your inner dimensions, it's a way of finding some kind of a balance within your life. It's important to all of your organs inside your body. So, for instance, by focusing on your abdomen, and this is one thing that a lot of Russian mystics did. They would say the Jesus prayer, which is, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me. They would say that over and over as a mantra and focus on as carefully as they could on the center of their abdomen. And coincidentally enough, although it's not a coincidence, the Tibetans have a famous exercise where they practice concentrating on the center of their abdomen, and it generates heat. And the sign of success is that a Tibetan monk can go out in the real cold and sit and meditate and generate heat through the abdomen through focusing on the center of the abdomen. So each of these chakras has a different sort of a wavelength, a different band or frequency for communicating with these other dimensions. You might think that each of the 7 chakras is a gateway to some of these other dimensions. And when we sleep at night, quite often the dreams are associated around a particular chakra, a particular area, depending on what a person's really had developed. Although we develop our chakras very unevenly. So the trick is to try to find balance and to not just focus on one like the heart forever, but try to go from the head to the throat to the heart and go down lower and go through a sort of a cyclic process of focusing on different parts of the body. I've explained most of this in developing Supersensible Perception. I've tried to bring out all the practical sort of engineering tidbits from Steiner that would help someone learn how to do this and show them what the benefits would be. This intuitive thinking, the thinking is that it's associated with the cerebrospinal system of the human body. If you look up cerebrospinal cavities on Wiki, you'll see that they look almost like a super streamlined alien sort of a head. And actually, what they are is it's a cavern within your brain, which has this very clear cerebrospinal liquid, which has very strange crystalline properties. When a slightly different voltage is applied to that material, it slightly crystallizes in strange ways. They haven't done a lot of research on it because modern medicine thinks it's just there to cushion the brain from if someone hits their head. But it's such an amazing, it's right in the center of the head, and it's full of the cerebrospinal fluid, which also flows down through the very center of the spinal cord, all the way to your perineum. And this fluid is slowly circulating, and the idea is that when you're meditating, when you have your eyes closed, or if you have your eyes closed and you take LSD or ayahuasca, you see very colorful, all kinds of things start appearing. So where are they appearing? They're appearing within your cerebrospinal system, within the central cavity of your head. And in yoga, they call it the Brahmarandra. The Brahmarandra is the cave of Brahman. And a lot of yogis say that's one of the best places to meditate on. So how would you do it? You have to be careful, because if you're meditating in your head, your brain might start talking to you. You might start waking up the active system. To counter that, or practicing things like mantras. A mantra is saying the same phrase over and over again. So a prayer could be a mantra, like saying the rosary in Catholicism, or of course, in India, they have lots and lots of mantras in Sanskrit. It's probably even good to learn a mantra that's not in your language, so that you don't have the mantra suddenly activate your thinking mind.
Mm-hmm, that's an interesting perspective.
What the mantras are, they're like an airlock between, going, if you're in a spaceship and you want to go into outer space, you have to go through an airlock. It's like a transition zone. So a mantra, reciting a mantra, say in your heart, try to focus on the heart and say, there's one famous mantra called Aditya Hridayam Punyam Sarv Shatru Bina Shanam. And what that means is you putting the sun in your heart, you will experience no evil. So this is what yogis would do walking through the jungles. There at night, they might be afraid of snakes, stepping on a poisonous snake. They would say Aditya Hridayam Punyam Sarv Shatru Bina Shanam. But by saying a mantra over and over, the active mind, which is normally thinking about mundane things, calms down and gets quiet, and the energy starts transferring into intuitive thinking. And at some point in intuitive thinking, I don't know how long somebody has to practice. It took me a couple of years of working on learning to meditate. I started hearing inner sounds, very high-frequency sounds, and many meditators go on from that to see inner lights. I've seen little flickering lights, but they only really light up if I take entheogens, which I haven't done for quite some while.
Interesting. Well, there's so many qualities about your work, Shelli, not just these practical applications of how to develop supersensible perception, but I think your science is absolutely extraordinary. I try to keep up with all of you who write these things, and I interviewed Bill Tiller a number of times over the many years, and Ingo Swann, and so many quantum physicists. And I like the fact that you included Bill Tiller's work and the kind of roughshod he ran into when he started recognizing that the consciousness of the operator, who was working in crystals and crystalline structures. And now that you mentioned sort of the crystalline nature of this part of the brain, it reminds me so much of what he discovered about the deltron particle, or the particles in water that can hold images and messages, and they're so densely packed with it. Maybe when we come back, you can talk a little bit more about some of the science that you share, because to me, I just think it's brilliant. Dr. Shelli Joye is our guest. His name is spelled Shelli, Joye, Joye. Net, and her book is called Developing Supersensible Perception, a knowledge of the higher worlds through entheogens, prayer, and non-dual awareness. Inner Traditions 2019. She's done just an exquisite job.
Hello, this is Dr. Robert Schwabel, author of Leap of Power and the author of the 7 Challenges program, which is comprehensive counseling for people who have alcohol and other drug problems. You can learn more about me and my work at www.7challenges.com. You are listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Zohara Hieronymus. I just completed an interview with her, and it was an absolute delight to talk to someone who's so smart, knowledgeable, and caring, and who really read the book.
Welcome back to 21st Century Radio. First caller at 410-922-6680 or 410-WCBM-680, or toll-free 1-800-922-6680. Who knows the name of our guest? Her book is entitled Developing Supersensible Perception, Knowledge of the Higher Worlds Through Entheogens, Prayer, and Non-Dual Awareness, and Inner Traditions 2019 release. So I just wanted to ask you to do me the favor of trying to summarize for our audience the thrill I had when you started talking about quantum physicists David Bohm and Carl Pribram, a neurophysicist, and how they came up with this thing called holoflux theory of consciousness, because then you start talking about the difference between the nerve system and the blood system, and that this is really what's going on in terms of how consciousness operates in the bio body.
Yes, well, I would like to try to describe it in 10 minutes, I guess, but it's actually, after Chapter 5, Indian Tantra, I go to the science of consciousness and how this all supports these practices. Chapter 7 is called the Cosmology of Consciousness, and Chapter 8 is the Physiology of Consciousness, and I have about 30 diagrams and images in each one, so
it's wonderful.
I obviously can't show you the diagrams but I'll try to encapsulate it pretty quick.
Thank you.
The theory is the holoflux theory came from Carl Pribram, the work of Carl Pribram, who was a neuroanatomist. He did a lot of research in memories, trying to find out where memories were stored in the brain. And this was back in the 40s and early 50s. They couldn't find where in the brain the memories were stored. In fact, they still can't. And Pribram became friends with David Bohm, a quantum physicist, and they came up with this theory that memories are stored in the implicate order, in the frequency domain. So let me explain that. According to Bohm, his equations, they were trying to figure out how to develop the first atomic bomb in Berkeley, and Bohm was one of the scientists working on it. He was actually a young graduate student. He wrote his dissertation on plasmas, and he managed to write equations that helped them create the atomic bomb. Unfortunately, his dissertation was classified, so no one's ever been able to read it since then, except for the CIA, I suppose. But he continued to develop his work over the years, and then met Pribram. His theory was, and his equations showed that it worked, they account for a lot of anomalies in quantum mechanical experiments that have been done that other equations weren't able to show. And the assumption that Bohm made was that the world is divided into 2 basic domains. One is the explicate meaning it's space and time, our everyday world, space and time. That's 4 dimensions. And then he said there's an implicate order that interpenetrates our world, but is extremely full of these 7 or 8 other dimensions. So it's very active, and it actually projects our universe in space and time out of very small dimensions. In fact, the dimensions are 10 to the minus 35 meters. It's the bottom of space. Space actually is granular, and it ends at 10 to the minus 35 meters, extremely small dimensions. So space is full of this plenum of holospheres. Each one is in a diameter of 10 to the minus 35 meters. And since space can't get smaller than that, within that holosphere, think of it like a little tiny speech ball you could do, within that there is no space and no time. So everything there is connecting. Everything is touching. When you think of it in terms of spatial dimensions, that if your doppelganger, if your memories are stored there, in India they call it the Akasha, and yogis since the days of the Upanishads and the Vedas have been able to tap into using intuitive thinking. They connect with the Akasha, where all information is stored and all memories are stored at extremely small, very high frequency energies. And so if you take any spot in your body, you can start moving in smaller and smaller, getting to smaller and smaller dimensions, way below the size of atoms and molecules, is what Bohm says is the implicate order. And the implicate order is what we try to connect with when we practice intuitive meditation. Some of the tantric exercises and the exercises that Steiner taught are ways of resonating with these deeper dimensions, which are very healing, because if these deeper dimensions communicate with you and your body at these very high scale dimensions that we live in space and time, then there's also a healing potentiality. But when people think all the time in the active mode and they're not in touch with their intuitive inner self, they get cut off from this connection with the healing implicate order, with the other 7 dimensions that we really live in. So the whole trick that Steiner was trying to teach in almost all of his lectures was for people to be quiet with their thinking and verbal mind and practice for even 5 minutes or 10 minutes a day in a really quiet, dark place to try to just calm the mind and listen. Just listen. In fact, Saint Benedict, who wrote the Rules of Contemplation for Benedictine monks, the very first word that he uses in his famous work is called listen. He just says, listen, ascolta. And it's by listening that we start to tune in to these other dimensions, these higher worlds, that if we ignore it, if we don't tune into them, there's actually a danger, because we become the prey to all kinds of psychic beings and psychic entities that we can't see. It's almost like being a blind deer in the forest. If we go through our life just thinking that, through thinking in words and arguing with people and talking to them and trying to put our point of view to them, that's not the way to really find a balance and a connection with them. You have to include intuitive thinking and emotional, imaginative thinking. You have to relate to other people with your heart as well as your brain, and even go deeper and see that within that other person, really deep down in these other dimensions, really is you. So in a way, you're talking to yourself when you talk to somebody else. It's not really even esoteric if you follow the physics of it.
Well, I think
because the implicate order is the seed of it all.
And that's what's so beautiful about your work, is that it crosses all of these fields, from the esoteric to the exoteric, from physics, to understanding biology. And I thought your beautiful way of talking about the nerve energy and then the polarization of the blood plasma, to me was new. Maybe it's not new to others in the audience, but I thought that the way, Shelli, you put it together, I thought, oh my God, a woman has to have written this. And then we only have about a minute left. I'm so sorry. I really we should have done 2 hours to do your work any kind of remote justice. What would you like to close with?
Well, I would like to close with tell people that it's really important for the sustaining of our civilization and our culture and even our United States for people to stop being so caught up in their mind and their thinking and their words and their arguments, and start to try to develop both some artistic practice. I mean, it can be fly fishing or, even jogging is kind of an art. Anything that gets you away from total exclusive thinking, looking at the talking heads, getting fed by the talking heads. All of this is making us go crazy.
Amen. I agree with you there. Dr. Shelli Joye, find her online, SHELLI Joye, JOYE.net.
Connected and stay informed on the #1 news talk station, Talk Radio 680, WCBM, Baltimore, and WCBM.com.